Here's everything new on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Welcome everybody, welcome to Apple Insider. It is Andrew here, and Apple has officially announced the iPhone 15 series, including the 15, 15 Plus, 15 Pro, and the 15 Pro Max. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the changes that Apple has introduced on its most high-end phone, the iPhone 15 Pro Max. So we're going to walk through everything here, ending it with those incredible new cameras. Use the chapter markers down below if you want to skip to specific sections, and let's go ahead and dive into it. Let's start with the design of the new iPhone 15 Pro Max and how it compares to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The design of the new phones is basically what we expected. We saw pretty much all these design changes in our metal models that we got earlier this year, and then even in our mock-up dummy units here in the full color, everything 3D. These also mimicked what we saw with the new iPhone 15 Pro Max. Still technically a 6.7-inch display in this all-new body. It has more rounded off corners, and it's actually a little bit smaller because of smaller bezels. So the screen itself is still the same size, but smaller bezels means a slightly smaller body. The titanium is also lighter than stainless steel, so it weighs less than the iPhone 14 Pro Max does. We're talking 8.47 ounces to 7.81 ounces, which I think is a considerable drop in weight. The new model comes in black titanium, white titanium, blue titanium, and of course, natural titanium. It also appears the new iPhone 15 Pro Max is more repairable than the prior generation. That's because Apple has a more easily removable back panel. For me, it seems like the back panel actually breaks more than the front does, so if that's the case, it's a really big repair to get that done and usually just ends up with a replacement almost the entire phone. Now Apple will be able to replace those back panels more easily, making this thing more eco-friendly and easier and cheaper to repair. The displays are entirely the same, the brightness levels, the resolutions, all of that is remaining the same between the iPhone 14 Pro Max and the iPhone 15 Pro Max. One other exterior change is that Apple has a new action button located on the side of the new device. This new action button will replace the mute toggle that was there. By default, it will still act as that mute toggle. Simply just hold it down. It'll give you some haptic feedback, letting you know you switch from volume on to volume off. But you can program this button to do really whatever you want. There's a bunch of built-in presets that you can choose from, things like turning on the flashlight, opening up the camera, all of these, but you can also tie it to a shortcut that you can program to do whatever. You could turn this into a home button on the side of your phone if you wanted to. But yeah, you can just tie it into a shortcut, you can run a home automation, you could start a car, lots of things that you can do with this fully programmable action button. Let's look at the connectivity features of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. First up, Apple did upgrade the device to Wi-Fi 6E. Apple's also using a second generation ultra-wideband chip. Now it's not calling it the U2 chip by any means, but it's essentially the second generation of the U1. So for all intents and purposes, it's basically the U2. The new second generation ultra-wideband chip has 3 improvements in terms of functionality. First, it has 3 times the range as before. So that means you'll be able to find things like your AirTag from further away than you could with previous versions of the iPhone. It also allows you to use person-to-person Find My tracking, which is really cool. So say you're at a farmer's market, you're at a fair, you're at a carnival, whatever it is, and you're trying to find a friend or a family member, you can now use precision tracking to find them in a crowd. You'll get an arrow on screen and you can find it as you navigate through people trying to find your friends or family. It's really cool and a big new feature for the iPhone 15 Pro. On top of that, we also have the ability on the new versions of Apple Watch. Both the Apple Watch Ultra 2 and the Apple Watch Series 9 have this new second generation ultra-wideband chip. Using that chip, instead of just pinging your iPhone when it's lost, you can actually use precision finding to locate your iPhone. So you don't have to make it make noise, but you can navigate around until you get close to it, see an arrow on screen, and then it'll let you know when you are basically right on top of it. So a few new features thanks to the second generation ultra-wideband chip inside of the iPhone 15 Pro Max. Other things with connectivity. There's Thread support for the iPhone 15 Pro Max. This allows you to communicate directly to certain smart home accessories. So before, if you were using Thread, you would need some sort of home hub that would act as an intermediary. So a HomePod Mini, the full-size HomePod, or an Apple TV all can act as those Thread border routers. But now with Thread baked into the iPhone, you can communicate directly to those lights, making them even faster and not having to communicate through intermediaries to get there. So a really nice thing for smart home users. Apple's also improved things with satellite connectivity. So first it offered emergency SOS via satellite, which usually involved first responders coming to your location. But there are times when you need help, but not necessarily first responders. Now Apple's offering something called roadside assistance via satellite. It's essentially the same thing, but for less urgent, vehicle-related issues. Whether you are in an accident, have a flat tire, your car is stuck, all of these things you can now enter via this emergency or roadside assistant via satellite, and they can get you help wherever you are, even if you don't have cellular connection. You can just use this new satellite feature. But what's really cool is this is actually coming to the existing model. So iPhone 14 Pro Max will also be able to use roadside assistant via satellite. Finally, Apple's added USB-C and Qi 2. Let's talk about those in a little bit more detail. Qi 2 allows you to use Qi 2 chargers alongside MagSafe. Qi 2 is basically MagSafe, but open standard, so it's not just tied to the Apple ecosystem. Unfortunately, things are kind of fuzzy right now. Nothing is certified for Qi 2, including the new iPhones. Qi 2 isn't expected to fully launch until October, so Apple has included it in the new iPhones, but it isn't certified yet as Qi 2 hasn't actually launched. When Qi 2 launches, you should be able to get up to 15 watts of speed on your iPhone, and several accessory makers told me that is what they expect with their new Qi 2 devices, that they will get 15 watts of speed on the iPhone 15 Pro Max. But until it's actually fully certified, we don't know. You still could get 7.5 watts of power, but Apple says it does support Qi 2. USB-C, on the other hand, the iPhone 15 Pro Max has up to 10 gigabits per second speeds, and you could even record directly into an external storage container when shooting video. It's really cool and should open a lot of possibilities for pro photographers and videographers who want to use that external media. You can also plug in other peripherals. You could plug in like a display for video output. You can plug in microphones, lights, all these things just over USB-C. In fact, there's power output from your iPhone too, which is helpful on the larger iPhone 15 Pro Max. So plug in your headphones like your AirPods and charge them from your iPhone. Same thing even works with your Apple Watch. Powering the iPhone 15 Pro Max is Apple's A17 Pro processor. This is up from the A16 Bionic, and the first time Apple's labeled one of its mobile processors as Pro. Probably because Apple is doing this big differentiation thing where before both the entry level and the high end would get the same chipset for the most part. Then Apple started last year by giving the new chipset just to the Pro phones and keeping the entry level phones on last year's chip. That's what they've done this year too. So last year's iPhone 14 Pro had an A16 Bionic. That has now went into the iPhone 15 and iPhone 15 Plus. And iPhone 15 Pro and iPhone 15 Pro Max got the new A17 Pro processor instead of just Bionic. So there'll be an entry-level version and a high-end version. Next year, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw maybe an A18 on the entry level and an A18 Pro on the high ends. We'll have to see how Apple actually plays this out. I can do a lot more on these new processors. Apple's done a bunch, including an additional GPU core. There's improvements to things like the neural engine and machine learning, all these fun things, but we'll save that for an actual in-depth hands-on comparison between the two phones, and we'll give you benchmarks and performance changes thanks to the new processor. That brings us to the cameras, which is arguably the best new feature coming to the iPhone 15 Pro Max. On the iPhone 14 Pro Max, Apple had 3 cameras, a 48 megapixel primary sensor, and then a 12 megapixel ultrawide and a 12 megapixel 3x optical zoom. This year, Apple still has a 48 megapixel primary sensor, and it still has a 12 megapixel ultrawide sensor, but it has moved to a 5x optical zoom for that telephoto lens. It's not a periscope lens, as many people predicted it would be. Instead, Apple is calling it a tetraprism design that basically bounces the light 5 different times before it hits the sensor, allowing you to get that extra range in a very compact space. Apple has even moved where the camera is positioned, with the telephoto moving to the right-hand side, which is where the ultra-wide lens used to be, just because Apple needed a little bit more space for the new, larger sensor. Thanks to that new 5x optical zoom, Apple is enabling up to 25x a digital zoom, which is up from 15x digital zoom on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Apple's added Smart HDR5, up from Smart HDR4. Now you can shoot cinematic mode in 60 frames per second at 4K, up from only 30 seconds in prior generation. Portrait photos can now also be live photos. You don't have to switch in between them. It'll automatically capture depth of data when a person, dog, or cat is in your photo. And Apple has made improvements to things like Deep Fusion and its photonic engine. One of my favorite little features is Apple's actually going to allow you to set your primary focal length for your main camera. So when you open up the camera app, it'll set to things like 34mm or 24mm, whatever you want it to be. There's also a bunch of other little changes here. Apple did improve the ultra-wide camera a little bit. I believe there's new sensor shift stabilization on the telephoto lens that Apple has. There's just little changes across the board with the cameras. I think the ultra-wide lens is improved on the sensor side. A bunch of small changes that should add up to a better camera experience, but there's a lot of really grainy details here, like what Apple does between 1 and 5 times optical zoom. Is that just going to be all digital zoom for 2, 3, and 4 times? It's a little bit murky, and Apple's doing some fun stuff with that 48 megapixel sensor, including giving you a new 24 megapixel mode. We're going to have to talk about all that in like a review in a more in-depth comparison. So that's it. That is all the changes that Apple has introduced with the iPhone 15 Pro Max compared to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Stay tuned to Apple Insider. We're going to give you an in-depth breakdown between the two, show you how the cameras compare, how performance compares, and all of that once we have our hands on the new phones. Let me know what you guys think if you're going to be picking up Apple's new iPhone 15 Pro Max, or if you're going to pick up another model, or just wait till the iPhone 16s come next year. Let me know in the comments or on Twitter at Andrew_OSU, or let me know on threads at AndrewO'Hara941. Otherwise, stay tuned. Got a lot more videos coming your way.